Today is Wednesday, November 15th, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here once again with my broadcast partner and co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Wallace Smith, how are we doing?
I'm doing fantastic.
Excellent.
Thanksgiving's on the way. Looking forward to it. How are you doing?
Good. We're gonna head down to Texas as we do.
Yeah.
I've kept Thanksgiving there for 25 years, and I always look forward to it. It's always a good time of year to be down there.
Yeah. And I know that comes up, and I miss you here, of course. Not just personally, but professionally too. You're a good part of the team. But I think a variety of our team here in editorial are taking breaks around Thanksgiving. So look forward to. Hope it's a safe trip.
Okay, what do we have for our audience this afternoon?
This afternoon, we are going to talk about pre-engagement counseling. Why? What's going on? Why does the church recommend that so strongly? I think it's a worthwhile topic for our teens and young adults, and that's what we're going to hit. And welcome back. Always enjoy that jingle. And just want to talk about the topic today, pre-engagement counseling. I actually have an anecdote related to this.
I mean,
Mr. Robinson.
that's a mouthful.
Pre-engagement counseling.
What,
It is.
What even does that mean?
It is. And we don't call it premarital counseling for cause, and we'll get to that. But the anecdote is kind of related to that because we used to say premarital counseling, and then there was an announcement. And I remember being in services years ago, before I was in the ministry, hearing that announcement. And it was based on, I think, I had notes at the time, like a lecture that Dr. Fall had given, Dr. Jeff Fall. And it was about how we really want to start saying pre-engagement counseling instead of premarital counseling. The principle was still the same, but it made it that much more clarifying that this is like kind of before you've kind of made a commitment, et cetera, that you really want to get married. When I say commitment, it's not actually the marital commitment, not a vow, but you know what I mean, an emotional commitment. And I remember at the time, there was a couple of young ladies sitting in front of me in the congregation where I was years ago. And one lady turned to the other, just quietly said, well, boy, why don't they just go ahead and tell us who to marry and get it over with? It just seemed like just a little bit of a jaded reaction. But I remember, and by the way, wonderful, I say wonderful young lady. She's married now and kids of her own. But I sympathized with it because it did seem like it's like, oh, when does it stop? But at the same time, I recognize the awkwardness of the wording of pre-engagement counseling. It regrettably hid something which really is vital, this is a good thing. This is something that the church does for cause. And even outside of the church, studies show that this kind of counseling before you commit to a marriage really does make a difference, in your marital success and your contentment and all the things we want to produce in a marriage.
So you're saying data even outside the church?
Oh, yeah, even outside the church, that kind of counseling helps. So anyway, it just seemed to me, with a mind remembering that young adult way back when, let's talk about that. Why does the church strongly encourage counseling before being engaged? And so I've organized our notes, Mr. Robinson, along these lines. And so I thought I'd talk about first why we do that, but then also who is it that goes in for counseling and when is the time? And the last two things, they might kind of blend together. And if they do, forgive me, Mr. Robinson, it's not as organized as perhaps it should be. All right. So why? I've got a few bullet points. And I would say, the first, to answer the question, why seek out the minister to engage in counseling before you're actually engaged? And I would say, why would you not seek counseling before you're engaged? I mean, isn't marriage really the second greatest commitment you're going to make in life?
I mean, it's tough for me to imagine. Of course, we always take, baptism and your relationship with God as number one.
Yes.
But past that, it's hard for me to think of a single decision you'll make that'll have more impact on the rest of your life than who you choose as your I was going to say life partner. That's so terrible.
I hate that.
We can't say life partner. Sorry about that. I just mean the person you're going to be with, your spouse for the rest of your life. That's a big deal.
Oh, 100%. If you think about it, I mean, baptism is the greatest commitment because that's forever. Your baptism commitment will still be impacting you a billion years from now, because that's eternal life. But marriage is right there at number 2, and because it's only for life. Once you die, that's the end of marriage, right? It's a human institution that's meant to end at number 2. It pictures a larger spiritual reality. But I would actually say when it comes to counseling, to a certain extent, it can be more important. I don't really mean to say more important. Counseling for baptism is important, but there's a different, let me just say this because I'm wording it very poorly. In my experience, there's a different dynamic in terms of counseling before marriage, because there's a lot of emotion involved, right? You tend to, you're drawing closer together. You see this person in a certain kind of special light and rose-colored glasses. And the counseling plays a role in helping you to see clearly in a way that most people aren't, well, some are, but most aren't attached to the idea of baptism with this kind of weird emotional fog, right? And so even though marriage is sort of, say, the second most, largest commitment you're going to make, it actually is one in which the counseling can play a role that it doesn't need to for the other. The other, it's a matter of making sure information is clear, you know what you're getting into, and that's a part of marriage, pre-marriage counseling as well, but also this idea of trying to see past the emotions and past the chemicals, if you will, to try to understand the reality of what it is you're doing.
Well, if you're coming, so why in this order and why at this time? If you've already been engaged, I mean that's about as firm a commitment as you can make that you plan to marry this person. So if you're coming for counseling post engagement, I mean the minister could still help you, but you've kind of already made the decision,
right?
Versus getting some. Okay, I get why it would be awkward. Okay, I do, but I think we kind of know when you're attached to somebody and they're attached to you, and you're beginning to think, hey, this could be a long-term thing, and it starts to become very, very serious. That is getting close to the time where you should come and talk to a minister to evaluate, is this,
right?
Are we missing something?
It's kind of like, let's translate it to baptism counseling. The time for counseling isn't when the baptismal tub is already being filled, or you got 1 foot in, I mean, admittedly, you can still back out.
I was thinking about getting baptized today. They're filling up the tub. What are your thoughts?
The point is, before you get too emotionally committed, right? Before you're really, that far in, well, that's the time to really, all the more when you start to see, hey, wait a minute, we could really, there's potential here to take this in a much more serious direction, a more kind of permanent direction. Well, isn't that the time you'd want counsel to make sure you don't start doing that? Or the counsel could be otherwise. I've talked to young individuals before, and I've said, man, that seems like something worth pursuing. If I were you, I think that would be wise to consider that. So we're not talking about always getting the answer no. We're talking about getting counsel. People tend to turn counseling into I need a go flag or a stop flag,
right,
when counseling is a matter of advice.
Yep.
Even if all the signs are good and you want to proceed forward, but then why not get good advice about how to proceed forward? How many people start a relationship in the earlier phases and just make mistakes and do it poorly, versus getting good counsel from someone about, here's what the Bible and experience says is if you want to start off on the best foot possible. So again, the point of this one is just that, to a certain extent, even just appealing to logic, why would you not want to get counsel if you're really weighing that serious a possibility?
Well, another thing I think maybe we could help clarify, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, Mr. Smith, but my understanding is, in general, the ministry is not making the choice of who you've chosen, like who you want to get married to. Their role is more to help you maybe see something. It's more like help you down your journey, and they're not approving or disapproving necessarily. Yet there are times that there's a clear red flag where a minister will say, this is not a good idea.
Right.
But in general, they're not approving yay or nay. Right. Of who you've chosen.
Exactly. In general. And there's definitely, like if someone came to me and said, hey, we've known each other for a long time, and I'm really thinking about possibly marrying this. atheist drug user or whatever. It's like, you know what? No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
The church is not, we're not going to do that. But in most cases, you're really looking at necessarily not a yes or no situation. You really are looking at a, advice, a counsel. There can be that kind of yes or no thing, dynamic to be sure, but all the more then we do want advice like that. But it's like there's never going to be the other way either. It's like, well, we don't really want to get married anymore. Well, I'm sorry, but I've approved it. So therefore, you got no. A lot of what you do in that counseling is trying to make sure people's eyes are as widely open as possible. So
making the most informed decision possible.
Making the most informed decision you can, absolutely. So that was kind of an appeal to common sense to a certain extent, but also biblically. And I've got 4 verses listed here, but man, there's really too many to list, and so I don't know if we need to go to all of them. But I wanted to at least give the first one. So sorry, to answer the question, why do counseling before you get engaged to be married? Well, because the Bible talks about how vital it is to get counsel for big decisions. Proverbs 1 and verse 5 says, a wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain, that is, will seek out wise counsel. Any young man who's starting to think seriously about a young woman as a potential bride, the Bible says, you know what? If you are a young man of understanding, then you're going to get counsel about that. You're not just going to rely on your own thoughts, your own feelings. You're not going to fool yourself into thinking, no, I can just separate myself from my emotions like a Vulcan and just use my mind. No, you're going to get counsel to help you do that. It's not weakness. That's right. It's so easy for a guy to think if I get help or something, it's weakness. It's the opposite of that. Seeking wise, not just seeking your friend's counsel, but seeking wise counsel, frankly, it's a sign of strength and maturity.
Well, listening to you made me think about the times my grown kids have asked for my advice, or other younger people in the church, even married couples, and they'll ask me occasionally something, and I know you get asked questions. And I would argue that most younger people are actually getting counsel, as it were, more often than they think already. And we think of it as advice. And there is kind of a bit of a line, a gray area between when getting a little advice crosses over into counseling. Like counseling can be very formal. But even just coming and, like as we both do, but I come into your office occasionally and I'm like, hey, Smith, what do you think about this? And you give me some advice or draw out some pros and cons, and really it's really a form of counseling, if it's a little more informal, let's say. But my point I'm trying to make is I've seen a lot of younger people very wisely come to older people and ask them questions all the time about things that are happening in their life.
Like, it's not as foreign as it seems. And why would this be any different? I think that's a great point, Mr. Robinson. There are times when someone, I don't want to say makes a pretense of getting counsel, because often they're sincere, right? Mm-hmm. But they'll get counsel from person to person when really they're waiting for the person to say the thing they want to hear. But I would say, I've also talked to a number of younger people. That's not what they're doing. They legitimately want to know. But, and maybe we'll get into this, I think we will to a certain extent with one of the later points, but there's a part of our culture that seems to try to teach people that you wouldn't do that in matters of romance, or you wouldn't do that in matters of, of love, if you will. No, that's all about the heart and the feelings and stuff. Well, no,
that's
the
more. Problem.
Yeah, exactly. That makes you more in need of someone who loves you, mm-hmm. or like a minister who is invested in you, to be able to think and to advise from a more distant perspective. That's really all the more when mm-hmm. you need that kind of counsel.
Right.
To give another Bible verse, I'm going to skip the second one I wrote and just jump to Proverbs 15. So let's say you don't do that. Let's say you don't get counsel. What does the Bible say in Proverbs 15 and verse 22? Without counsel, plans go awry, but in the multitude of counselors, they're established. And I kind of like this for different reasons. Again, what we haven't said it in a while. I used to kind of say this like every podcast, but really what we're trying to do here on the podcast is to help you think biblically. Well, you might think, no, I'm going about this very logically. I've really thought about it. I've put a list of pros and cons, or I've got a little spreadsheet. I don't know what you would do, but I've really been thinking about it. So you've made plans. You've looked at well, that's great. But Proverbs 15:22 says, hey, those plans, that sounds great. But you know what happens to plans without counsel? They go awry.
Yep.
You just know you're not smart enough or wise enough to think of all the variables, and that's why you have a multitude of counselors. And a multitude of counselors, and I think we'll get into this a little bit later, that doesn't mean going to 18 different ministers to look for the answer you want, but that means you've got your pastor, but you've also got your mom and dad. Mm-hmm. You might have your aunt and uncle that you're close to. You might have grandparents. I would encourage you to consider friends, but the challenge with friends is you're really wanting the kind of advice that a real friend is willing to give, when some close people that seem like close friends, they just don't. They don't want to tell you what they don't want to hear.
Are the wounds of a friend, right?
Faithful.
I heard a great Christian Living class at camp one year about that.
That's right. You want the kind of friends that are willing to give you wounds instead of kisses if they're faithful friends. That's right. So multitude of counselors doesn't mean shopping around and to see, what works or what matches what you already want to do. It means being humble enough to seek out those wiser than you. And that would definitely include your pastor, your local ministry. You know what? I'm only going to mention this third verse. Again, there's tons of verses that talk about getting counsel. And saying that, I guess my question to you is why would these verses not apply to deciding to get engaged or not, right? If they're talking about, well, I was thinking about buying a boat, but I want to get some counsel. I'm not sure if that's a wise way to spend my money. Well, that's good. I'm glad you'd want to get counsel for that, let alone picking the person you're going to spend the next potentially 80 plus years with. If you live that long, why would you also not get counsel? So it's actually, like I said, it's a very strange verse, but it's Proverbs 24 and verse 6. And I hope it's not taken poorly. Please let me explain after I read it. Proverbs 24 and verse 6 says, "For by wise counsel you will wage your own war." And no, it's strange, right? "And in a multitude of counselors, there's safety." Okay, bear with me. I'm not saying that marriage is a war against each other. It's not. However, again, let me take this in an odd direction, but I feel the full conviction of this. One, the devil is always looking for a foothold in your life. And in a sense, Paul talks about the weapons of our warfare. What is our warfare? We're pushing against the lusts of the flesh. We're pushing against the temptations of the devil. We're pushing against the kind of thoughts he wants us to think and the kind of lifestyle he wants us to live. And we're pushing back against these ugly spiritual influences. And the fact is, your marriage, your future marriage, teens and young adults, that relationship will have a greater impact on your life, as Mr. Robinson said at the beginning, than really any other human relationship you have in this world. And to get off on the wrong foot on that, it just gives it's like a gift to the devil. It's like, hey, you want a foothold into the rest of my life to mess with me and to make my path towards what God wants me to be harder? Then I tell you what, let me just not treat marriage seriously enough. Right. And the Bible says, so in a sense, you are kind of waging war, and who you choose to be wrestling next to you, to be fighting next to you in that spiritual warfare is one of the most important decisions you could possibly make. Why would you not do that with counsel? Try to get counsel about who that would be. So again, I know it's an odd verse, Mr. Robinson, but it struck me as applicable.
I like how you've applied it.
Do you?
I approve.
Oh, you're
not looking for my approval.
Hey, no,
I do like that
something.
because you're right. As you and I, we talk about all the time how our country has spiraled kind of down into the spiritual abyss, and the attack on society and the attack on marriage. Like, the society is not in general, the society is not family friendly anymore. Mm-hmm. And so it does become, you and your spouse and protecting your family, and like you want somebody in the trenches with you that's giving you wise counsel and battling with you and resisting the influence of the society around us.
I can think before I got married, one of the things I thought about my wife was that she impressed me as someone who would be a good mother. She wasn't a mother, but I hoped if someone's going to marry me, they would be willing to have my children, and she impressed me as a Christian woman who would be a good mother, And I can look backwards, and I can say now here at 53, look back at me at whatever I was. I got married at 22, so younger, and think to myself, man, I didn't even know how important that was. And now I can look back, and I have adult sons, and think I am so grateful for the kind of mother she was. And that really was a crucial factor in that decision. And I would say you and I tend to talk about our wives a lot here. And even personally, we'll talk about, I'll mention, I think one of the topics, like on the podcast I want to talk about, it was actually my wife's idea. And you'll say all the time, I appreciate your the insight you'll pass on from your wife about some verse she's read or something. And think about that. That's been crucial. I mean, what an influence our wives are. We would be different human beings if not for the kind of influence they've had. And that's going to be the same for anyone who chooses to get married. You will become a different person of necessity. That's how crucial that person is in your life. Why not get counsel about something like that? The Bible says you should get counsel about that.
Well, and then once you have kids, as you mentioned, you'll forever be linked to that, because the worldly idea that, well, if it doesn't work out, I can get a divorce. But once you've had kids, the idea that you no longer have a relationship with that person is impossible. You'll be linked to them forever because of the kids you had. I know that's kind of strays into a different territory, but to your point, this is a critical decision that's being made here, and you're making it when you're still pretty young. I mean, if you meet somebody getting married before you're 25, well, just scientifically, biologically, your brain hasn't even reached its fullest maturity yet. So all the more important for you to get advice on this critical decision, because this is nobody's fault, but you're just young and inexperienced, and you're making a critical decision.
Yep, all the more. All right, so those are some Bible verses that relate to this. Let's take a look at another tack, and I think we've suggested some of this, but I want to go into it more explicitly. Another reason to get counsel before actually getting engaged with someone, and that's just the kind of thinking in the world that we may not realize it, but we adopt and we absorb way too easily. And that is this kind of carnal, worldly approach to marriage and to romance that, again, we just kind of passively pick it up. I know I did as a young person. My mom and dad never sat me down and said, hey, I want you to think about relationships the way the world does. I just passively pick that up. We're like sponges. And we can think that we're kind of seeing through all of that. But honestly, why risk that you're not? That's what counsel can help us do, especially, and we have listeners in different countries. We appreciate all of you young people listening all over the world, but we're definitely speaking from a Western country, in particular from America. And I can say here in the West, in America, generally it seems like marriage is pictured as something that is mainly, it's just about you. It's just about you two. You two, you love each other. It's all about you. Your parents don't make a difference. Your future children don't make a difference, and your grandchildren. Who really tries to tell people in America, hey, make sure you think of your kids, grandkids, great grandkids, and the rest. Or, what do you think your great 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 grandfather would think of this marriage? Well, why do we even care? It's really just about us. There's this Western, I say ideal. It's not really ideal, but this Western picture of relationships and romance that, as weird as this is, and by the way, the whole theme of this point is counseling helps you dispel those thoughts. But I actually picked Samson, a comment from the old judge of Samson in the book of Judges chapter 14, that reminds me of this thinking. It's probably depicted in the worst way in Judges, but honestly, I think he would make a good American. And Mr. Robinson, I know you've been working on some studies related to Samson, so I hope this.
So what's funny about that you say that?
Yeah.
Firmly off topic now, is. So here's a spoiler. I haven't even given this sermon yet. Samson is the personification of Israel in the time of Judges. And one of the things I can't help it, he reminds me of America a little bit, because he's like big and strong, but he's kind of a bull in a china shop. and he's just kind of out there doing
that's
whatever he
interesting.
wants. I have to give more detail on it than
That is interesting. Okay, well that's great. I didn't even know you. I did know just for so y'all know. I do know Mr. Robinson's been studying on Samson and working on a sermon, but I did not know the point he just said. So I thought of this thing Samson does where he sees a woman and he decides, hey, I want that one. I want to marry that one. So in Judges chapter 14. Verse 1, it says, Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Verse 2. So it says, he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah. That's my Samson voice, just so you know. I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. And that's kind of what you back then with your parents. There'd have to be a trade of funds and all sorts of, I can't remember what they call it. It's not a trade of funds, but you know what they call it, the dowries and things like that. So verse 3 then I always picture this in kind of a stereotypical Jewish mom's voice and stuff. But then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife for the
Why can't you find a good Jewish girl?
That's exactly what I pictured. But you have to get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines. And Samson, totally not listening, definitely not taking counsel. It says Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. It just sounds like
that verse 1, you can more literally render it, she is right in my eyes.
Verse 3 there, which is, instead of pleases me well, she's right in my eyes. Wow. Yeah, that's actually, I like the wording of that, because that's kind of what we think. Oh, this person is right. This is right for me. This person is it matches me so well. This will make such a great husband or wife. Now, I want to highlight, so it's not a distraction, verse 4, it says that his father and mother did not know that this was of the eternal, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. I want to make sure that doesn't mean that God approved of this relationship.
Right.
God is not just saying, oh, no, Samson's fine. Yep. What a good boy. No, Samson was already a lustful, sinful guy. Yep. And God is simply moving that in the direction that's going to give him a cause to accomplish his purpose. Yep. If Samson at the beginning had been, God, I am your servant in all things, how may I serve you? God could have used him without leading him by the nose, and leading him by the image of a pretty girl here or there. So that's not meant to cast a good light on what Samson has done. It's just saying that God, if he can't use our strengths, God's going to use our weaknesses, but he's still going to accomplish his purpose.
I think it is good to highlight that, because I know I've been asked questions before from a younger man here in our area a couple of years ago. It was a story about David and what David had done, and it wasn't David at his best, and like why was that okay? And I realized, there's an assumption that because it's the Bible has recorded what David has done, and God doesn't specifically call him out that must be okay, and that's not the case at all.
Right.
Like, you can't assume that just because conduct is recorded in the Bible that it must be okay.
Right.
Not at all. In fact, that's one of the key, you've already hit on it. One of the key things about Samson was, it's not hard to pick it out of the narrative if you study it very long. It's almost like God deliberately used a stubborn, obstinate person for what he was going to do, because he was happy to go along with it. I mean, he loved being the biggest, strongest guy out there. I might mention one other thing, because I'm guilty of this. When I was younger, I'm guilty of this. There's another example there with Jacob and Esau. And, Esau's out there marrying foreign women as well. And he sees that his parents don't like it.
Right.
That it bothers them. So I think he finds somebody from their family and marries him, but it's kind of, just kind of a Band-Aid. But the point is, it's so easy to be dismissive of our lineage. Like the word posterity, we see and I'm like, what is posterity? And I finally had to go look it up, what posterity is. I mean, it is your heritage and where you're from, and that includes grandparents and aunts and uncles and a whole thing.
Right.
And I know Hillary Clinton coined "It Takes a Village," but whatever her motivation is, like, I agree with that. Like, we didn't even have, our family, like everybody, was mixed everywhere. My parents lived in one state, and my sister for a while lived in another state, but for a brief time we lived in the same city, and it was fantastic because my sister was particularly good, and she would give me good advice when I would ask her for it, about the kids, and she was good at, and they felt comfortable with her, and they would occasionally go ask her questions, which I was very comfortable with. But just imagine the idea that you have this whole, and I know patriarchy, it's down with the patriarchy, but this whole patriarchal system where you have, man, in theory, generations of people living together that they can help each other and can give you wise counsel. And
Yep.
And I was guilty of that when I was younger. I didn't value that. I was kind of dismissive of it. I did kind of have a little bit, like, I wasn't fighting against anything, but I did sort of have the idea that, it's me and my wife and we're going to go on and take out the world. And it didn't take me long to realize that that wasn't the best way of looking at it.
I'm so grateful that you put it that way, because that's exactly the point we're trying to make here, is that all the more when you're young, especially in this particular emphasis, young and in the West, young and an American, counsel can help you have that larger picture. The idea of bringing dishonor on our great-great-grandfather by some action we take, we don't tend to think that way. But when you look at the biblical picture, he really does see things that way. So in contrast to Samson, which I do see, that kind of modern mentality, like, oh, this woman pleases me and I please her. Isn't that all that matters? But I have two examples in the contrast. One is Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 2, we have this, because Nehemiah is a part of, Judah is in subjugation. There are people that have been conquered, and he is serving as a cupbearer before the king. And so it's starting in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, "It came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king." He was the cupbearer. Now, I'd never been sad in his presence before. And it says in verse 2, "Therefore the king said to me, 'Well, why is your face sad? You are not sick. This is nothing but sorrow of heart.' And so I became dreadfully afraid," he says. I mean, he's a cupbearer, and so that's...
So what is the significance of being the cupbearer?
Okay. That's good to point out. Really, when you have a king and you don't want to be king anymore, you try to kill him. So back then, they would poison the cupbearer was a trusted individual because he bore the cup that the king would drink from. And so to poison the king, you had to get past the cupbearer. And so he had responsibility for that, which all the more if the king looks at his cupbearer and his cupbearer is disturbed or something's emotionally bothering him, well, that's going to concern the king as well. In this particular case, that made Nehemiah nervous. But here's it's part of my, Mr. Robinson would point out, my Myers-Briggs type. I give more context than I need to. The next verse is the kicker. So what does Nehemiah respond to the king? In verse 3, it says that he said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire?" Well, that's just not an American mentality. Right. At least growing up as an American, you weren't taught to think of the place where your fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers were buried. That just didn't mean anything to you. You just kind of start over every life, and you build from scratch, and you're not really carrying on any kind of heritage. But that's not the way God thinks about it. And I will demonstrate it in this case, because I know it's one man. Nehemiah is not God. He's a man. But we'll demonstrate in the next verse I want to read that God does think multi-generationally, and that he does want us to have a larger picture. And Nehemiah is reflecting a godly mentality that your choices reflect on all those who came before you, and they'll be attached to your family name. And the one that I want to highlight that it's God's mentality as well is in Psalm 78. I will read it slowly as I type it in. Psalm 78.
You know why you're looking that up?
Yep.
So Artaxerxes is a Persian king, as you know. And I've mentioned this before, but listening to the podcast last summer, just a bit more than a year ago, that went in depth on some of the Persian kings. And like I went into it with no expectation. Like I don't feel like I know that much about the Persians. And after a while, I came away with it thinking, man, if you became the emperor of the Persian empire and you didn't assassinate somebody to get there, you weren't even trying. Like assassination was like by the most common way you ascended to the throne was by assassinating.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. It sounds very Klingon to me. All right. So in Psalm 78, you have this statement, and they're talking about the truths that they understand. And in Psalm 78.
So is this like my truth? Like what are we talking about here?
No, real truth,
okay.
Actually. So it's the psalm is titled, it's a contemplation of Asaph. But he's talking about their commitment and what they know they need to do. And it says in Psalm 78 and verse 4 about these truths. Psalm 78 verse 4, we will not hide them, that is these truths, from the Father. The truths, by the way, their fathers had told them. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Eternal and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they might arise and declare them to their children. Verse 6 just blows me away, Mr. Robinson. He's talking about, and this is under inspiration. This is inspired scripture. This is God using this individual to write these things, that God has in mind not only that he gives his truth to a people and that they would give it to their children, but even the children that haven't been born yet, the next generation that doesn't exist, that they would also receive that truth, and that those children who have not been born yet would arise and declare them to their children. God is literally thinking at least 2 generations deep into generations that haven't even been born. And so this whole point I'm trying to say is that most of us, I know I did, we absorbed the attitude of the civilization around us. And when it comes to marriage and having a serious relationship that leads to marriage, a lot of us have absorbed these kind of Western ideas that make it all about, hey, I love her and she loves me, and that's all that matters. But man, that is not the picture the Bible has. The Bible talks about being mindful of those in whose footsteps you are following, the people that you represent, and then also actually thinking not just of you and the person that you believe you're in love with, but the children to come after them and the children after them and the children, thinking of your great-grandchildren. It takes a larger picture. And counsel with the ministry is meant to help us have that larger picture. It helps us to expand our mind and to focus on those things that we need to be focused on, because I didn't realize it to the depth I do now, that the decision I made when I married my wife, now that I have children getting married here and there, Benjamin's married, I realized, man, that decision is going to affect their kids. The kind of parents we were are going to affect those kids. And that perspective is important. And counseling is a way to help make sure you have that perspective. So that was that point.
Good point.
Thanks.
No, well said. I like
got
that.
kind of rambly there, so thank you. The next point.
Okay.
What is? Okay. The next point. Without counsel, it's easy to we get caught up in what we want, right? I know I really want to marry this person. I think this person is the person. I hope it's the person, and I'm going to act like it's the person. We can get caught up in that thinking, and as a result, if there's any things that would make that unwise, it's easy to start dismissing those things. Like, it's not a sin. The example I used to pull up, for instance, is debt. Because I've had to wrestle with various dumb debt at various stages of my life, debt that didn't make sense to have. And
I've had a lot of experience with that.
So let's say I were counseling to get married. Okay. And let's say I was under crushing debt. I mean, it's clearly stressing me out day in, day out. And that's going to have an impact on your marriage, right? And it's, in fact, maybe, because you're going through things. And by the way, all cases are different. I'm making up a hypothetical scenario. Thankfully, the dumb debt that I got into happened after we got married.
Well, I mean, you categorize the top 5 sources of conflict within a marriage, and finances top 2, 3.
Definitely up there. That's right. So, if through counsel, I might be advised, is hypothetical. It's like, if you were to hold off for 8 months or something, right? You look at your position, you've actually got the ability now at this time to take on an extra job, to do this, and you could actually crush that debt, get it out of the way, and be able to start on the right foot without that burden. Now, having heard that, let's just say I might be tempted to respond, well, hey, I hear what you're saying, but it's not a sin, right? Can you point to a scripture? Can you point to a commandment? Am I breaking a commandment? Well, the minister, it may not be a sin. He's just trying to say, well, no, he goes, I'm not saying it's a sin to get married with soul crushing debt that might possibly make your wife cry every night for, the next 8 months. But that doesn't mean it's wise, right? It doesn't mean it's not something to consider. And that brings up a principle that Mr. Weston keeps trying to remind us of, that if we're asking only if something's a sin, it's the wrong question. Like 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23 says, all things, talking about the sloganeering, the kind of slogany mindset that the Corinthians had in terms of their freedom in Christ, speaking to the things they want to do. Oh, all things, as in all these things, are lawful for me. But he says, not all things are helpful. You might think all these things are lawful for you, but you know what? Not all things edify. Edify means to build up. God doesn't rob us of free will, and he does allow us to make unwise decisions, and not everything can you point to, say, one of the 10 commandments being broken, or it's not like eating a ham sandwich. And yet at the same time, it doesn't bring us closer to thinking like God does. It doesn't actually build us up. It doesn't help our life in Christ. It makes it harder. And, I appreciate my mother-in-law before she was my mother-in-law, but she was on the verge of being my mother-in-law. She was giving us advice, and she did give us good advice about, in our case, I was going to be a teacher, and I was a teacher for years, a high school teacher. And she commented, she highlighted, she said, you guys are getting married. It's going to be the same as that is me, Wally Smith, my first year teaching. So I was going to be married while I was teaching summer classes in preparation for my first big teaching job. I had a job. I definitely wanted to have a job, in terms of.
How old were you?
I was 22 at the time.
So that's pretty
We
young.
got married.
Yeah.
And she said, you guys could wait a while, right? And what we didn't do is dismiss that advice. She thought maybe having a year or two under my belt as a teacher, you get through some of those pressures and such. And in that particular case, we thought, no, I think we can do that. But we did talk about it. We took it really seriously. The minister didn't necessarily see a concern with the circumstance. So we were definitely getting counsel. And I have to say that even though we didn't delay, we went ahead and did get married when we did, she was accurate. It was very good to know that, because the pressures of being a brand new high school teacher for me, they were really strong, and it definitely was a source of stress in our marriage. But that's part of actually the last thing we'll say, and this is kind of a good transition to that, is that part of getting counsel before you get engaged, it isn't like a lot of this have been about whether to get engaged or not, or how quickly to move or not. But there's also the benefit of beginning that counseling so you know what to expect, and you know how to do it well, and you know how to handle the challenges that arise. There's challenges and temptations that arise, even in the engagement period. I'm not just talking about sexual temptations. There's all sorts of things. And why wouldn't you want to get counsel about that, so you know what to expect, so you know what lies ahead, from someone who has counseled lots of other couples and has had the chance to see the aftermath of all of that counseling. So anyway, to wrap up this part, and we do, someone called us on it over the last podcast. Apparently we said about 20 minutes in, well, we want to kind of wrap it up. And
my wife noticed that as well. She said, the people who brought it up, I said, I thought it was kind of funny. 21-minute mark. You said we're about to wrap up. You went another 20 minutes.
So this time we are moving towards a conclusion. But
made me realize I ought to track how long we've been going, because it didn't feel like 21 minutes. I thought we'd been podcasting longer.
Oh, at that particular time? Yeah. Well, right now, just so you know, we're in the 43-minute range. So,
Okay.
and we're moving good pace. I'm going to repeat the same thing. We're getting close to the end, and then 4 hours later, we're still going.
Still a lot of notes.
No, I think we're getting close.
Okay.
So, having talked about why you would engage in this kind of counseling, I keep saying engage in pre-engagement counseling, we want to address just a couple questions then real quickly at the end. First, when should you do that? Well, that's why we changed the name to pre-engagement counseling, because you do want to talk before you get engaged. You want to get counsel before you've actually formally asked someone, hey, will you marry me? Oh, good. Well, now let's go see if this is a good idea or not. No, you want to do that beforehand. And I know it seems awkward. Like I talked with someone once, like, what does this mean? You might as well just go ahead and get on one knee and say, will you, Alice ceiling wall, go to pre-engagement counseling with me. Like it's virtually and it doesn't have to be like that. In fact, I'm saying it really normally wouldn't be like this in the best of scenarios. But let me mention first one verse, the verse that I do think applies, and that's Proverbs. In fact, probably could have said it in the first section. It's probably in the bad
Proverbs
place in my notes.
31. That's the kind of girl you want to get.
No, that's actually I definitely recommend reading that. But Proverbs 18 and verse 13. Proverbs 18 and verse 13, it says, he who answers he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. And for you to actually get engaged before you've counseled about whether it's a wise idea or not, it's kind of like you've already answered the matter. It's like you've already decided, you know what? Yeah, it's a great idea for us to get married. We're going to do that, and then we're going to get counsel about whether it's a wise idea. No, that's what the counsel is for. It's to help you fully consider the matter. But in terms of the awkwardness of that, let me highlight something. And I think that when we get to the final part of what we're talking about, this makes even more sense. It's not a matter of necessarily proposing counseling to someone and then going to do that. But if you have a natural relationship that you've built with your local minister where you want to go to him for advice on big things, don't think of it as just pre-engagement counseling. I tried to encourage my kiddos to think of it as serious relationship counseling or relationship counseling. Whenever someone is starting to catch your eye as like there's some real potential there, even if you're not going as a couple, wouldn't you consider as just one person thinking, I'm thinking there's some real potential here. I'd like to get some advice about that.
Right.
I'd like to talk to someone to help sort out my thoughts.
No, that's a good point.
Is it? Because I've always felt like it seems like it's just semantics, but it's not. If you think of it more as relationship counseling, then even if you're not yet going together, it's something you as an individual might want to say. And I don't want to name the particular example, but the first time I know someone did that, actually acted on that advice, and came to me about a potential relationship. It was wonderful as a minister to have, in this case, a young man come and say, hey, I've kind of been thinking about this, and I talked to my dad, and what he thought, and I'd just like your take too. And it was a very natural counseling environment and relationship.
And I get caught up in this as well, because I can be very literal. For example, like a lot of times when the Bible talks about, judgment and the great white throne judgment and all these different things, like there's this courtroom setting with a judge,
Right.
But the same thing, like counseling, that's a very formal, and you come into an office and you sit in leather chairs and, you have the light on and everything. But just a minister you have a relationship with after services one day, you kind of come up to them and nobody's around and say, hey, I've kind of been talking to so-and-so. I don't know. What do you think? It is informal, yet at the same time, that kind of idea crosses over into counseling, but it doesn't have to be a big formal meeting,
Absolutely.
the office.
Thank you. I didn't even think of the word formal, and that's exactly it. It doesn't have to be. Now, it gives the minister the option. He might say, well, tell you what, why don't you stop by? Because it maybe has some particular thoughts about the career choice that you're looking at or made, or who knows? He might want to have a larger opportunity. He might say, hey, I've been wanting to actually talk to you about this. Who knows? Maybe he has a question for you. But if there's a relationship there, that's what you work with. It kind of reminds me of. I had someone ask me about counseling for baptism once, and said, well, how do I know I'm ready to counsel for baptism? And I said, well, you're kind of treating it like this sort of formal area you enter as if you're kind of pre-evaluating whether you're ready for baptism. I said, it's counseling. I said, why don't you just talk to the minister and ask the minister, hey, I'm kind of thinking about it. What do you think? The minister might say, oh yeah, you got a ways to go, but I said, if you have to, think of it as counseling about counseling for baptism, but just talk to the minister. It doesn't have to be make an appointment and stop by the office or the house. It might even be just walking up to him after services one Sabbath and saying, hey, I don't know that I'm ready to start counseling for baptism, but honestly, I am thinking about it. What do you recommend? Help me sort through these thoughts. And just like you said, think of it more as just a product of a relationship with your counselor, like you would for mom, dad, uncle, aunt. In fact, that brings us up to the last point. So
Okay.
maybe we'll finish here
Do
before
it.
sundown. With whom do you counsel? And it might seem like a silly question, but bear with me. For pre-engagement counseling, with whom do you counsel? I think we've tried to say, I don't think we just said it off the mic. I'm not sure that it's not your mental counsel with your buddies, that are going to agree with you. But obviously you should counsel with your minister. If you're really serious, you do want counsel from your minister. Why? For any reason, God in heaven has appointed that person as your shepherd, and you are in his flock. So if you're of an age where you really are thinking about making a relationship more serious, really pursuing a serious relationship that could lead to marriage, lead to engagement in marriage, then talk with your shepherd. I mean, that's kind of been hopefully the implication. I think we've said it literally several times, but I also want to say, don't just talk to your minister. You should be talking with your parents. You should be talking with your family members that are invested in you. In fact, I would say I don't know, does it make sense, Mr. Robinson? Because we talked about this a bit earlier, and I can't remember what your read on this was, but I guess we talked about it a little bit earlier in the podcast too, but I know I felt pressure. Is pressure the right word? I feel like the environment when I was growing up was that when it comes to quote unquote romantic relationships, that was just a matter of me. And I can honestly say, growing up in the world at least, man, I didn't talk to my mom or dad at all about girls I was interested in or anything like that. And that's not the way God really intended it. God wanted us to have a dialogue with the adults in our life that are invested in us.
Yes. I was trying to think how my, say, courting, if I can use an old-fashioned word, of Audrey went. And see, my parents lived out of state, so that was a little different. But I think at that point still lived. Her parents had been transferred from Florida to Austin, and she was living with them but working in Austin. And I was over there with them all the time, so we were around her family quite a bit. And then we used her dad to counsel with. So, and he was the minister in the area.
Oh,
so,
right. That's a situation.
Kind of like a double dose, if you will. It was like we got the minister's counsel, and that was dad,
Right.
But I did talk with my parents about it at some point, but I don't think I approached them as, wasn't asking for their permission, but I was interested in their thoughts about it. But they liked Audrey right away. I think they didn't think I was going to be able to do that well. So
that's funny.
So they were there. It was great.
That's funny. Yeah, I would say my mother and the man that would become my stepfather, they knew Janine early on. Way before we were engaged or even dating seriously, she had come, I think, over the summer to visit at the house, and it's right after my dog had died. I remember our dog, and she brought a little stuffed dog that was not into stuffed animals, but I got to admit that was really nice. And anyway, so my mom got to know her and my stepfather. This is before we were seriously dating, and yet they really liked her. In fact, I came to conclude quickly they like her more than me. Actually, that's I think they're more concerned about her in terms of marrying me than they are concerned about me. But that said, I know her parents as well. We were close and we talked. I talked with her mother about our relationship on more than one occasion. And so by the time I actually did, because I did go over, it was during the feast, and I went to talk to her mom and dad to ask for their permission to ask her to marry me. It was not like a surprise. I mean, this was something that we kind of talked about, and that's the environment we're talking about. It's the world is trying to press on us this kind of the picture you get in romantic movies or rom-coms where it's just about the couple, but it's not just about the two of you. There's a whole world around you. There's a world of people who love you and who are invested in you. And unlike keeping them out of the discussion, it's the opposite of that. They should be very much a part of the discussion. Your family should be very much people that you are talking to about these things. And the minister. The minister is a part of your family in a real way. He's there leading your congregation. He's your shepherd. And so that's really part of the theme here, is that it shouldn't seem unusual to talk about these things. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a formal moment. It should be actually a natural outgrowth of you living life as a part of your family and a part of the congregation of God.
You know, one of the things you said triggered an old memory of mine because you're exactly right. When you're young, and because I was this way, and I know others have been this way. It's very common. You vastly underestimate what it's going to mean to marry this other person because you are thinking in just terms of a couple. But I'm sorry, your person that you're marrying comes with, in most cases, a mother, a father, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. I mean, I know that not everybody's alive for various reasons, but um, when you get married, you have in-laws, and they're not going anywhere. You know, you will have to deal with it. And when Thanksgiving comes along, and when the feast comes along, and and she wants to see her family, and I'm obviously always thinking more from the husband perspective, but it's never just you and your spouse. Well, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say never, but in most cases, it will not be, and you will have extended family that you're now related to through marriage, and they're going to be there, and they're going to want to see their granddaughter or their daughter or their brother and their sister, and just because you married them, that doesn't go away.
That's something that the Bible really does picture, is that a marriage isn't two people uniting, it's two families, right? It really is. Uniting, there's family lines, and a name does change in terms of the wives. However, absolutely, that's part of the reality of it. And again, there's that Western thinking where it's all somehow about you, when it's not. Your children will have grandparents, and that should mean something to them, right? And
Right.
You and the grandparents aren't just going to be you. I mean, like our kids, they're going to have children, and we will be their grandparents, but also so will the other families. They'll have a set of grandparents there. That all of that is part of a larger world. And to bring it to the point of what we're talking about today, counseling can help to have that frame of mind. And that frame of mind is what you need when you're evaluating, not just after you're already engaged, you're already committed, and you're just looking for a rubber stamp, but when you're actually trying to make that decision.
So what would you say to kind of conclude things, assuming we're concluding, to a young couple or a young man or young woman who might be thinking they're headed in that direction, who's like has some concern that coming to their minister is kind of like official, and he's going to tell me what I don't want to hear, or he's going to tell me not to marry this person, like it's this approval process?
Well, one, I would try to say avoid thinking of it as an approval process, because that's not what it's meant to be, and think of it more of just as getting advice. In fact, if that's what I've learned in life, one, not to expect everything to go exactly the way I want it. I like to think I've learned that. And then secondly, I've learned that sometimes a little transparency is the ingredient that we often avoid. If that's what we're concerned about with a minister, that, look, I'm not trying to make something formal, I'm just wanting your thoughts, then you say that, when you're talking after services, and say, hey, I want to bring this up, but I'm not trying to make a bigger deal out of it than it is. But I'd like to, I've just been thinking about possibly settling down, or possibly, looking at a serious relationship. And I listened to the podcast on livingyouth.org, to encourage me to reach out to you and share these thoughts. And, can I get your thoughts? So, this is going to sound crazy, but even getting counsel about counseling, talk to your mom and dad, talk to, your parents. Even if you're a young adult, you probably still have parents who care about you, and say, hey, get what they think. Our parents are natural counselors. They're right there, and let them help you figure out. It's like, well, that's actually a good question. Why don't you go ahead and talk to the minister at that point? It sounds like you and Alice or Betty or, Kareen, whatever her name is. It sounds like actually you guys might be at a point it would be wise for you to get some counsel. The theme is you don't have to figure all this out on your own, and you should get counsel, even if it's getting counsel about getting counsel, as strange as that sounds, Mr. Robinson.
I was asking Mr. Rod McNair one time, we were talking about baptism counseling, but from the ministerial perspective, like what's your role in it? And he said something I never forgot, and I loved how he put it. He said, really, you got to be careful not to, I don't remember exactly what word he used, but like you're not directing their counseling exactly. You're more like a shepherd, a guide it's their journey. They're trying to sort through what they need to do to be ready for baptism. Is there something maybe they need to work on a little bit, or are they on the right path? But you're there just to shepherd them on their journey. You're not really. I mean, there are times a minister has to say, "Hey, I don't think you should get baptized right now."
Right,
that does
right.
happen.
Right.
But I would say in 95% of cases, they're just there to guide you through the process. And I would think that marriage counseling would be very much like that. Let go of the idea that it's like going before the judge. It's I'd say the vast majority of the ministers, I probably shouldn't put it that way, but like they're there and they just want to guide you. Spoiler, the ministry wants you to get married, but they just want you to be smart about it and be wise about it and not be naive. And, so my wife and I, we took the Prepare and Enrich, which is a very common tool we use.
Mm-hmm.
And there were two things that were highlighted as friction points, and I actually genuinely don't remember what the second one was, but I remember the one was finances. And 27 years later, it's still,
it was spot on.
No, we're better, but that's definitely was a friction point, and it was good to know that, because then kind of when it came up, well, it wasn't a surprise.
Yeah,
and that took about 15 minutes.
And that's really actually part of the theme too of the counseling is, that early kind of counseling where you're just reaching out to the minister and saying, "Hey, I'm starting to think about really pursuing a relationship. What should I have in mind? What should I have in mind if I'm actually thinking of going in a particular direction?" It's those teasing steps, and it is what you just said there about how the minister, he's actually rooting for you.
Yes.
It's easy to think that he's a hurdle you have to get past, but that's not right thinking. The Bible itself has so much to say about every aspect of our lives. And the counselors that God has given us, our minister, our parents, etc., they're not hurdles to overcome. They're not barriers or tests that we have to pass. We have to start thinking of them as partners. They're people who are working with us. They're a part of our extended family. They're people who want us to have a blessed life every much as we want one. Actively counseling with the ministry and the adults in our lives that God has given us as counselors before we get in too deep and make commitments is just simply a wise thing to do. In fact, really, when you keep that in mind, why would we not want to counsel with someone before making such an important decision?
Smith and Robinson.